Here we are. Wow, that was quick. So here we are again, and very happy to see you on the screen again, my friend. We have star of the History Channel's Ancient Aliens, and illustrious friend of ours, prolific author who has now written another book, Andrew Collins. Here we have your latest, and we are very happy to have you.
Yes.
Be okay if I
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's a bit of a deja vu moment, isn't it?
Yeah, well, ask me anything. Unless it's political.
Oh God, no, we're not going there. We don't do that. My first question about this is, how did you come to know about? I get it. Let me have it.
Right, okay. It's
Sobek.
That's the crocodile god.
Right.
And it's Nefer, which means beauty, and then the U at the end, the Neferu, means beauties. So she is the beauties of the god Sobek, basically.
Oh wow! So how did you come to find out about her? I mean, I know you stumbled.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to evaluate whether I'm among friends or not, but I think I probably am among friends, so I think I could probably tell the truth. I mean, it really began in 1981, really. I know it's a long time ago. Most of you never were born at that time, but I was doing a lot of psychic work with friends at this time. And one of my colleagues, Graham Phillips, who has just got his own new book out, another one coming out in July, basically started having a series of dreams about this Egyptian royal female, and she was appearing to him, and she basically was sort of suggesting that he had to do some kind of ritual. So, you know, he decorated the walls. I mean, literally. I mean, did this image on the wall of the flat that he was living in, which I had previously been living in as well. And he did this ritual. Some weird stuff happened, which I'm not going to go into, but you know, I didn't think about this at the time, and he came down to see me, and he told me what happened, and he gave me all of his notes. And you know, I looked at them, and I thought, well, you know, this royal female, you know, from Egypt must be check-outable. And there were enough clues that he gave to tell me that this had to be Sobek Neferu, that she was the only one that reigned around 1800 BC. She was the only one that was connected with the area around Saqqara and Dashur, which she is because her pyramid was built just to the south of the Dashur pyramid field in a place called Mesguna. And, you know, all the indications seem to be that, you know, it was her. And across the years, you know, I've come across a number of people who have had dreams or visions which have featured Sobek Neferu, and this intrigued me to the degree that obviously I learned everything I possibly could about her, and I vowed one day to write a book about her. I mean, nobody's ever written her biography, so there's no actual book about her. Now, bear in mind, I'm not an academic. My background is journalism, so I'm not an Egyptologist. So obviously the way that they will receive a book like this is sort of like with mixed feelings, I think is the best way of putting it. I mean, Jan Summers, who is a proper Egyptologist in America, she's actually written the foreword to the book. And, you know, various other Egyptologists have sort of given me the nod as we go along, that I'm on the right course. I've asked them certain things and they've come back, you know, with encouragement or advice, some of which I've mentioned in the book, some of which I can't because, you know, they don't want to be associated with me. And that's it really. So, you know, the book was published by Inner Traditions, and it is the fullest, well, the only account of her from you know, from her early days right the way through to her death, which I think was by ritual death, a suicide, you know, just like Cleopatra, to where she spent her early years, which I think was in the Nile Delta, to the impact that she had on Egypt, which I think was absolutely immense. I think without her reign, this world would be a different place, and we can come on to that.
Yeah.
And the fact that, you know, even though most of the viewers out there are going to be saying, well, I've never heard of her, you do know her. you do know her. You have seen her in films, because if you've ever seen a horror film where an Egyptian royal female comes back from the dead and plagues the living, it's her. And the reason why it's her is because all of those stories are based on one novel, and that's The Jewel of Seven Stars, that was written by Bram Stoker, obviously the author of Dracula, which was published in 1903. And all these later accounts, even though they might have given her a different name, or even have put her in a different, time frame. By the way, she actually lived during the 12th dynasty, which was a very successful dynasty, which was at the tail end of the Middle Kingdom. And thereafter, a very tumultuous dark age occurred in Egyptian history, which is known as the Second Intermediate Period, which we can come on to, where basically Egypt basically fell. I mean, it fell to these warlords that had come in from Canaan, called the Hyksos, or Shepherd Kings, as they're remembered. And they took over the show. They took over northern Egypt. They trashed most of the rest of the country. But they left this puppet dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs in the south of the country. And they were the 13th dynasty. But what they didn't realize is that because of the way that Sobeknofru had virtually created this dynasty and passed on the baton of sovereignty to them and said, look, it is your job now to, look after Egypt to make sure it rises again. They were able to do this, and their descendants rose up against the Hyksos and threw them out, basically then creating the New Kingdom, the most prosperous period of Egyptian history.
So she really did have a massive effect.
Yes, she did. Yeah. I mean, it's a complex story because, I mean, her father was a king that reigned for about 5 decades, named Amenemhet III. He was incredibly successful from all accounts. And towards the end of his life, it would seem that he decided that his eldest daughter would take over from him. Now, her name is Nefertar, or Neferutar, which means the beauties of the creator god Ptah, spelled P-T-A-H.
Never heard of it.
And so much so was she obviously being lined up to become the next ruler that her name started appearing in a cartouche. Now, a cartouche is like this oval frame within which is the name of the monarch, literally, but quite clearly this was unusual because she was not even crowned yet, not as far as we know, and yet her name was appearing in a cartouche. Now, it would seem as if, because she was probably quite young and there had never been another female Egyptian pharaoh ruling both Upper and Lower Egypt before, it seemed that the best thing that they would do is put her with her younger brother, who was Amenemhet IV. In other words, he was of the same line as the father, but all the indications are that he was from a different mother. Okay, so you had the brother and sister being lined up, or half brother, half sister being lined up to rule the country together. But then something happens. When Nefertar reaches the age of between 16 and 18, he dies suddenly, very clearly suddenly, to such a degree that her tomb had not been made ready, and her body is placed inside the pyramid of Hawara, next to where her father is about to die and be buried himself. Although, this is the sequence as it happens. So her body seems to have been placed in there whilst her own pyramid was being finished elsewhere at Hawara. And Hawara, by the way, is in an area called the Fayum Oasis, which is about 60 miles to the southwest of Cairo. It's a beautiful, lush, green area around this huge lake, which was known in ancient times as Lake Moeris. And so the daughter dies, Nefertar dies. So what's going to happen? Well, they've obviously got to switch to some kind of plan B. And the plan B would seem to have been that Amenemhet IV would reign on his own But it would seem that at this point, this is where Sobek-Nofru comes into the fray for the first time, because it would seem like she then ruled with him, and I think that they were full brother and sister, in the same way that he was going to rule with Nefertar. And so, and whether this was an official or an unofficial arrangement, we don't know. It could have been unofficial, but she ruled with him. And there are various reasons to suggest that, because if she hadn't have done, there's no way that she could eventually have just appeared out of nowhere and ruled the country for 4 years. It just wouldn't have happened. So for the first few years, it seems that brother and sister worked out fine as far as ruling the country. And it would even seem that Amenemhat IV commissioned the building of 2 pyramids, one for him and one for his sister Sobek-Nofru. And these were at this place called Mazguna, which is just on the southern edge of the Dashur pyramid field. And this is where they were going to be buried. Okay. But the one thing we can say is that his pyramid, there was a burial, because it's quite clear that tomb robbers got in there. But her one, which is known as Mazguna North, was definitely not used. There's no indication that there was ever any burial there. So he may have been placed in the pyramid, but she certainly wasn't placed in her one. Now, that I mean, the implications of that is quite clearly she was buried somewhere else, and possibly in complete secrecy. The reasons why that will come on to. But it would seem that during his reign, he started to change the country. He became a lot more progressive than his father. What I mean by that is that he virtually created an open borders policy with incoming peoples from Canaan. So in other words, a lot of Semitic people, many thousands of people, were crossing the borders and entering into Egypt. And they were, getting different jobs, whether it be as servants, whether it be in the army, whether it be in the navy, whether it be for engineering projects. And some of them, it would seem, started to become very high-ranking officials, and probably had done even by the time of his father ruling. And a lot of people started to object to this, because they were saying that if this continues, Egypt is going to fall. And so I think what happened, and again, this is what all the evidence seems to suggest, is that certain factions approached her separately, Sobek-Nofru, and said, look, the country is going to fall if your brother continues to take it in this direction. What we said, we will support you. We will support you as the next, ruling monarch of this country, provided your brother can be got rid of. And I think that he was murdered, and she would certainly have had knowledge of that. Now, whether she was directly involved with it or not, I don't know. And that the brother was murdered, and that allowed her then to take over the country for 4 years, ruling on her own. There doesn't seem to have been, any kind of consort with her. And what she did was she completely changed everything. She shut the borders. She shut a lot of trading with Canaan, which included a lot of mining operations in the Sinai, which were quite vital for the country. But she shut down the country, to try and take stock and restore a certain amount of sovereignty in the country. And it would seem as if this did the trick, because, as I said, she then seems to have created this 13th dynasty, and the first 2 kings of the 13th dynasty would seem to possibly have been sons of her brother. Now, I know it sounds weird, because if she was involved with his death, then why would they support her? But this does seem to be the case. If they weren't the sons of her brother, they may have even been her sons. We don't know. But what we do know is that at least 5 of maybe 6 of the kings of this 13th dynasty all ruled under the name Sobek. Sobek what was it, Sobek Hotep, which basically means sort of serving, the god Sobek. And it would seem that they also created her as this living deity. In other words, they created a cult in her name, which continued on throughout this Dark Age, this Second Intermediate period, and would seem to have still existed during the New Kingdom period, and that people, still revered her as this almost like a deity. And this was interesting because it would seem that wherever she was buried was lost, certainly to the general public, even by the beginning of the New Kingdom, because there's evidence from a tomb in Thebes that people were going there believing that that's where she was buried, and it clearly wasn't. It was a priestess of Hathor, goddess Hathor, which we know the name of now, and it certainly wasn't her. And this particular priestess lived, a few generations before her, and yet inscriptions are being left on the wall in the name of Sobek Nofru. So it's clear that people didn't know where she was buried even by this time, and that again tells us that there's a very good chance that she was buried on the quick after her death, and probably because people were after her, and they would have been after her body as well. And so what happened to this body? Well, I mean, people don't know. I mean, my personal belief is that she was buried somewhere in the Fayum, because she had so many links. That the temple of Sobek was there, a palace was there. And I think that she was, doing magical rituals at a temple on the north side of the Fayum Lake at a place called Casa El Saga. And this is this very strange megalithic temple, which is one of the most enigmatic buildings in the whole of the country. I mean, it looks like something out of Giza, with the made from these huge polygonal stone blocks, like the Valley Temple of Khafre in Giza. And it may well date to the same period, but there's no question that it was reconstructed during the very late 12th dynasty. And I found two pieces of evidence of partial cartouches, or not so much cartouches, but inscriptions that appear to be in her name that were found in the vicinity of the Khazar Saga temple. Nobody has ever put this together before, so there are clear indications that this temple is connected with her. Now, the temple itself is known locally as the Temple of the Crocodile. And the reason for this is that it's associated with a legend which says that a Egyptian pharaoh was being chased by dogs, and they came to the shores of the Fayum Lake and thought they were going to die. But at this point, a crocodile appears and says, jump on my back and I'll take you to safety. So as you do, he got on the top of the back of this crocodile, and the crocodile takes them out to an island and leaves them on an island, and they're obviously saved, and that's that. And supposedly, as a thank you to the crocodile, the Khazar Saga temple was constructed, in honor of not just the crocodile, but clearly the god Sobek. Now, this is a silly tale, of course, but it probably contains kernels of some very interesting information. One, to do with the belief and practices associated with the crocodile god Sobek, which was seen to be a form of the sun. In fact, the belief during the time of Sobek Nofru was that Sobek himself was the sun god, basically. He was the first god to be created. And it was said that each night, when the sun set, it would then transform into a crocodile. In other words, as Sobek Ra, the sun in the form of a crocodile, swim through the lake from west to east, and then at dawn would rise up onto the shores, resume its form as the sun disk, and rise up into the sky. This was the belief at this time. And
Wow.
this is a really interesting statement. It's clearly linked with the story about the pharaoh being carried on the back of the crocodile. So, you know, we're going to go down rabbit holes with all of this, but, you know, this is the sort of stuff which is beginning to come out to do with her.
Fascinating. I mean, could this, am I echoing because this is driving me crazy?
A little bit.
A little bit. Now, is my sound stopped or am I still here?
No, you're there.
Okay, good. Could that be that they're riding on the back of the crocodile? Could that be where they're transferring from to heaven, so to speak, where they're going on to the afterlife? Is that like a symbol of that?
Yeah, definitely. Because normally the sun in ancient Egyptian religion was said to go beneath the earth through something called the duat, like the underworld, at night from sunset. There were like two portals, you know, where you entered at sunset and where you came out at dawn. And during the time of night, it would go through the earth or underneath the earth. And this was envisaged almost like a sort of cave underworld. And it would be this same cave underworld that the dead pharaoh would take, the same passage, this same rite of passage would occur at the point of death, because it was believed that once a pharaoh died and was placed in the tomb, the whole idea was that they would go to the west, they would go underneath the earth, be reborn on the eastern horizon, which was known as the Aku, and they would then rise up and then somehow rise up to the constellation of Orion, which was on the Milky Way. But then it would once they're on the Milky Way, they would then continue their journey into the northern part of the sky, where the so-called circumpolar stars were, you know, the stars that never set. Right. And it was believed that the afterlife was in this direction, and that the pharaoh would actually become a star themselves. You know, their spirit would become something known as an ak. An ak is generally translated as meaning something like glorious spirit. Now that's what was basically in place from the Pyramid Age onwards, but different things were going on in the 12th dynasty, which climaxed during the reign of Sobeknofru. I mean, firstly, they changed the position of Upper and the point of demarcation between Upper and Lower Egypt. I mean, in the Old Kingdom, for instance, it was far to the north, corresponding with the Old Kingdom capital of Memphis. That's, in other words, this was the latitude that marked. Right. The north of that was Lower Egypt, and south of it was Upper Egypt. But even before Sobeknofru's reign in the 12th dynasty, they moved it down to correspond with the latitude of the Fayum. And the reason for this is because they built a new capital city on the Nile corresponding to that same latitude. And everybody assumes that's simply the reason why they did it. But it's not. In my opinion, it's not. It's because they believed that the Fayum was the place of the ancestors, the place where their original ancestors had come from. And the reason why they almost certainly came to this conclusion is that on the north side of the lake is evidence of ancient settlements going back to the Neolithic age. And you would have been able to find the tools of these people, evidence of their settlements, and even stone circles that I believe would have been, I talk about one in particular in the book, that would have been seen as quite clearly the acts of their ancestors. Plus, if the Khazarel Saga temple was already present, they would have looked towards that as a connection with the kings who ruled at Giza. And there are a number of pieces of evidence to suggest that the kings of the 12th dynasty, including Sobeknofru, were very interested in the builders of the pyramids. They saw them as their forebears and wanted to link with them, not just, from a point of view of administrative, political perspective, but also from the point of view of the afterlife, of aligning their own pyramids to connect with those that had previously been built during the pyramid age. For instance, both the Khazar Saga temple and the Mesguna North pyramid, which is the one that she was destined for, are both aligned to the same star. And this is El Tanan, which is the brightest star in the constellation of Draco, the celestial dragon or serpent. And it would seem the reason for this is that she and obviously the people that preceded her, the pharaohs, saw a sky figure occupied by these same stars, which was Draco, Ursa Minor, and to a degree Ursa Major, which took the form of this huge hippopotamus. And on the back of this hippopotamus represented the mother of Sobek. Her name is Neith, a very, very ancient goddess who almost certainly goes back before dynastic times itself, and may well have been recognized as this sky figure at the beginning of dynastic history. And on the back of this hippopotamus is a crocodile. And that crocodile is obviously the son of Neith, and that is Sobek. Sobek is the son of the goddess Neith. So they would seem to have been the two most important deities that Sobek Nofru was interested in. Obviously Sobek, her own name is Sobek. Right. She used within the cartouches the sign of the crocodile in a way which was incredibly unusual. Normally it would be spelt out in hieroglyphs, but she actually used the image of the crocodile to denote her direct association with this creature, and quite clearly the god himself. And clearly that the Pharaoh was the place of the crocodile. It's the place of Sobek. There were crocodiles in the lake. There's accounts even from classical times that talk about rituals involving crocodiles in the Pharaoh area and connection with the area of the labyrinth. And the labyrinth, mention of that, is that what she would appear to have done is to establish this new center of Egypt, which we know under the name the Egyptian Labyrinth. And this was an enormous structure. It was bigger than Karnak and Luxor temple put together. And in addition to that, if you add the Ramessean on the other side of the Nile, on the west side, and put them all together, the labyrinth was even bigger than this. Wow. And Herodotus, who was a Greek writer, Greek historian, who wrote around 450 BC and went to the labyrinth and describes it, he says that this monument was grander even than the Great Pyramid. So, this must have been an extraordinary structure in the past. And he said that there was as much underground as there was overground. So there was a huge subterranean labyrinth associated with it as well. And presumably this is where a lot of the rites and rituals to do with the crocodile took place.
Do you think they'll be able to dig it up and find it?
Well, people have been trying to dig up the labyrinth since the beginning of the 19th century. The first main archaeologist, a German by the name of Karl Lepsius, did a lot of work there. I think it was in the 1840s. I look at all of his diary accounts, and the fact that he clearly found a number of blocks of stone with Sobek Nofru's name on, as well as those of her father. And then later in, I think, the 1880s, and then continuing on for a few years, a few decades after that, Flinders Petrie, the very famous British Egyptologist, also dug at the site of the labyrinth. He also found a lot of blocks that had both Sobek Nofru's name and also that of her father. And what's interesting, though, is that her role in connection with the labyrinth has clearly been suppressed. Not just by the archaeologists of the 19th century, who clearly saw her involvement as like some kind of put in a few finishing touches on it, you know. Whereas no, it's quite clear that she had a major hand in reconstructing this huge complex.
Yeah. Why do you think they've done that? Suppressed it all?
Well, patriarchy, isn't it? You know, I mean, obviously, these great pharaohs, you know, clearly didn't need women to, you know, better them. And I think that this was the attitude of the 19th century, just in the same way that it probably was in Greek and Roman times as well, where I'm pretty certain that her name was also suppressed and that her role as a very important female pharaoh was essentially ignored. I mean, what's so interesting is that there's very few historical references to her outside of what the archaeologists have found. But what we do have is accounts of the reign of her father, both from Greek tradition and also from Arab tradition, which has come from much earlier Christian Coptic tradition in Egypt. And in Greek tradition, she's mentioned in the same breath as obviously her father, and the name that's given there is Nitocris. Nitocris is obviously a name that honors the goddess Neith, Neith.
Right.
And it's said, the story that is said of her, which is recorded by Herodotus, says that her brother, the king, those are the terms, the words that are used, her brother, the king, doesn't say which king, was murdered. It clearly states that. And that Nitocris decided that she would take revenge or get over those that had killed her brother. And so what she did was she invited all of them to a huge, great banquet and then let waters in through some secret canal into this room, you know, presumably from the Nile, and they all drowned in it. But it said that after this, so that she herself, you know, did not suffer vengeance from anybody else, that she put herself in this room full of hot ashes and killed herself. And you think, what the hell is this? You know, please try and interpret this story for me. Well, firstly, you've got to say to yourself, well, hold on, if you've said that she was involved with her brother's death, so why would she be taking revenge on those that were involved with his death? Well, I personally have suggested that this did happen, but I don't think the people she killed were those that were responsible for the death of her brother. I think she was taking out any political opponent. In other words, those that were supporters of her brother who would cause problems for her during her reign. So basically, she just took the lot out, basically. I mean, you know, this might sound rather harsh, but, you know, these were very different times where unless you ruled with absolute strength, you were going to be pulled down by those below you who were just waiting for you to show a weakness. She had to come across as an incredibly powerful woman because she was the first woman, remember, in Egyptian history that had been properly crowned king of both Upper and Lower Egypt. And, you know, so in other words, she's got a hell of a lot on her shoulders, not just ruling the country, but being the first woman that's ruling the country. So, you know, unless she was ruthless, she wouldn't have lasted for 5 minutes, let alone 4 years, which is the time period that she did rule the country.
So what changes did she make?
What was that? Sorry.
I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm echoing because it's nothing to do with anything that I'm using. What changes did she make?
Firstly, political. As I said, she shut the borders. She stopped further people coming into the country, or certainly severely restricted it. So she stopped a lot of foreign trading with the area of the Sinai and Canaan, and that was point one. So in other words, she shut the borders again, right, quite literally. which again was completely the opposite to what her brother was doing. And it would seem even her father before her was a very tolerant and quite progressive guy. But unfortunately, it looked like her brother was being influenced. So he was obviously very, very young. He was probably no more than 16 at the time when he ruled. I mean, you'll see in books that he was older, but he wasn't. I show there's the only images that we have of him suggest that he was extremely young when he came to the throne. And the thing is that if he had been any older, why wouldn't he have ruled? Why was his half-sister Nefertari being lined up to become the principal ruler of the country? And the only answer can be is that he himself was not very old at all, you know, and that he would play second fiddle to her. So I think that he was easily influenced, and I think that he was being influenced by people that wanted to manipulate and take the country in a certain direction, and that certain factions realized what was going on, probably connected with the temple of Sobek. And I think this is one of the reasons probably why they went to Sobek Nofru and said, look, you know, we'll support you, you know, we will ensure that you become the next monarch, you know, providing that you can give us access to your brother and we can take him out, quite literally. I think that's what happened. Now, I think that the people that were against her were the priests of Heliopolis, the priests of Ra and Atum. And the reason for this is that her brother would seem to have been turning his back on Sobek, on the Fayum, and on Egypt almost as a whole. And he had intentions of founding a brand new kingdom in the Sinai, focused around this religious center known as Serabat el-Kadam, which would seem to have been important to him, his father, and various other of the kings that had preceded them. And this huge cult center was actually dedicated to the goddess Hathor. She plays a very important role in all this story as well, by the way. And so her brother was trying to set up this, and clearly he was being manipulated into doing it. I mean, you know, obviously he was going along with it and thought it was the right thing for the country, but others felt that this was the wrong direction that Egypt should be going. And this is what split up, you know, brother and sister, to the point that I think that towards the end of his reign, they were miles apart. And what's interesting is that her brother would seem to have favoured the cult of Atum and Ra over and above that of any other god or goddess. And, you know, in personal inscriptions, he wouldn't say anything about Sobek. He was talking about Atum. Atum is the creator form of the sun god Ra. Mm-hmm. And that means that he was affiliated with the temple of Heliopolis. And the interesting thing about that, and it all makes perfect sense, is that they were the ones that were embracing this new progressive attitude in Egypt, and particularly associating themselves with the incoming Canaanite peoples, who saw them as like, you know, the particular Egyptian religion that they could embrace. And this is certainly the case, because once the Hyksos warlords entered the scene, which was just a couple of generations after Sobek dies, they embrace the cult of Heliopolis, the cult of Ra, and they are crowned, you know, with names that give them Ra, and, you know, at the end of their name, sort of thing. So, you know, there's no question that Heliopolis was siding not only with her brother, but also with the Canaanite peoples that were coming into the country. I mean, Heliopolis itself is right at the end of at least two major routes into the country from Canaan, basically. So in other words, all the peoples that were coming in, if they weren't settling in the Nile Delta, were coming in and settling in the area of what is today Cairo, which is where Heliopolis was. Yeah, this had been a major center for Canaanite peoples for many thousands of years already. There were settlements just to the south of there, which were unquestionably of Canaanite origin. So this was the political affairs, and the thing is that the people that obviously came to Sobek-Nofra and said, look, you've got to make some changes, we've got to get rid of your brother, they were right, because the country does fall in just a couple of generations. So if they had not have gone to Sobek-Nofra, the country would have fallen. It would probably have just become almost like another vassal state of Canaan. Right. And this world would have been completely different. Egypt would never have risen up. You would never have had the new kingdom with all the kings like Ramesses, Thutmose, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti. None of these names would have been known if it hadn't have been for Sobek-Nofra.
Stopped it. That's kind of brilliant. It's never mentioned her mother. I mean, her mother was insignificant, or did she die, or?
No, I mean, her mother's not mentioned in connection with her, but it is mentioned in connection with her brother, because Manetho is a chronicler who lived about 300 to 350 BC, and he's the one that gives us the Chronicle of the Egyptian Kings, which was quoted in various later sources. And when he comes down the 12th dynasty to Sobek-Nofra, who he refers to under the name Skemiophris, and that's an obscure name, but it seems to be a corruption of Sobek-Nofra, which for reasons which I'm not even going to bother to go into at the moment, but it is. And he says of her that she was the sister of the previous king. Okay, and the previous king is Amenemhet, which is unquestionably Amenemhet IV. Right. So in other words, he makes it clear that she is the sister, and we can only assume full sister at this point, of the previous king. Okay, so they were brother and sister. Now there is a temple on the south side of Lake Fayoum at a place called Medinet Mardi. Okay, and this was erected by her brother and her father, probably when they had a very brief co-regency. In other words, they both ruled side by side, and that was probably only for about a year to two. Okay, and the name of his mother is given in there, and it's Hetepti. So this Hetepti is almost certainly the mother of both Amenemhet IV and his sister Sobek-Nofra, but not the mother of Nefertar.
Oh,
she seems to be the result of a previous marriage, with a royal queen. I can't remember her name at the moment, but it is mentioned, and so she's her name, but she clearly died. Well, right. I mean, or certainly was out the picture, because a new lady then comes in, and she is now the queen that's mentioned officially, and and it seems pretty certain that we're dealing with two different people. So we're dealing with one daughter from one marriage, who seems to be the oldest, and then a brother and a sister from a second marriage that seem to be slightly younger than the original sister.
That would make sense then. The original sister was given some sort of
exactly.
Everything it would mean.
That's exactly it. I mean, why exactly she was being lined up is a difficult one, and I think that the only answer is that she was the most obvious choice. What I mean by that is she was the oldest sibling. So why shouldn't it go to her? And if these were progressive times, then let her rule the country. But we'll back it up by putting her younger brother alongside her, right. And they can rule together. But then something happens. Nefertar dies. Now, what happens to her? She could have died through natural causes, she could have died through an accident, or she could have been bumped off. What's it going to be? And obviously we haven't got any answers, but all I will say is, who stands to benefit from her death.
Right. It seems that it's an easy way to do it. Get rid of her, take her out.
Yeah. That's it really. And I mean, I don't want to paint Sobeknefer too badly, because I think that all the indications are that she was, doing good for Egypt. But these were very ruthless times. And, you only got to look at, let's say, the Ptolemies, or even the Caesars in Rome, and know that, everybody bumped everybody else off to stay in power. And I give examples in the book and that show two separate examples from that very dynasty of this kind of what they call infanticide. In other words, plots of assassination of people within the family. There are two other examples from that very dynasty that are recorded by Herodotus. I think one's by Herodotus. I can't remember the second one. They both may be from Herodotus. So, the idea of siblings or family members or whatever bumping each other off is not unusual whatsoever.
Yeah, it's not new. Absolutely not. Denise, does it say where she's buried? No, they haven't found her body. Andrew said earlier that they haven't.
No. I mean, as I said, I'm pretty certain that I know roughly where it is. And what I mean by that is, by deduction, I would have said that she would have kept to being in the Pharaoh for two reasons. Firstly, if she died on the quick, and if they were after her, they were coming for her, which I think is exactly what happened at the end of her reign. I think that she entered into what she might have seen in terms of a ritual death. In other words, to have gone into this room, just like Herodotus tells us, where he says there was like hot ashes. Another word is even closer to what's the word, incense. Right. It implies that this is a special room where incense burns. And in Greek, this is known as an aditon, which is like a special room, can be underground, can be in a separate part of a building where ritual activity would take place. In other words, you would venerate the ancestors or venerate the gods in them, and clearly you would burn incense. And I think that what was happening is that the incense itself would have contained some kind of psychoactive substance, but also I suggest that she probably intook further substances as well. And I show that the comparison between her death and that of Cleopatra. Cleopatra kills herself after Mark Antony, her lover, partner, dies in 30 BC. And you are told, obviously through the classical accounts, that a snake was smuggled into her, apartment, whatever it was, and, put up to the arm, and it killed her. Well, that's symbolism.
Of course, yeah.
But, the snake is a symbol of the goddess Isis. The snake was her personal symbol. Isis, Cleopatra was a personal devotee of Isis. She wore an Isis pendant around her neck. All the indications are that she was a full follower of Isis, maybe even a princess of her. And Isis was the goddess of magic and medicine. And so the snake therefore becomes the symbol of medicine, just like it does across Egypt, the Near East, Anatolia. So that story about her and the snake is masking the fact that she almost certainly took some kind of psychoactive substances that allowed her to slip into death. And again, this is not just me making this up. I quote academic, papers that seem to back up all of these theories here, particularly Cleopatra using psychoactive substances, so that she would quite literally walk into death.
Wow. Poisoned, as we would say. Yeah,
it's poison. Obviously, look, with any psychoactive substance, it needs to be carefully monitored, particularly if it's, something quite harsh that you only take a very small amount. I do give various examples of psychoactive substances that would have been available, during this, during dynastic Egypt, that have been recorded. And I think that any one of these, if you don't take them in the right quantities, if it's not checked, it could easily kill you, very, very easily.
Absolutely. The stupidest stuff can. So, how does that follow on? Who comes after the Sobek people? Just so that we can get an idea of where it all goes.
Well, okay, it's not a simple story, because once she dies, not one but two separate dynasties begin. One is the 13th dynasty that is quite clearly loyal to her memory. They deify her, and a number of the kings all have names honouring Sobek, clearly they're honouring the same temple and the same, ethos which she herself was associated with. In other words, they are following clearly in her footsteps. Okay, so let's call them the Egyptian dynasty. Then there's another dynasty, which is the 14th dynasty. Now they rule from the Nile Delta, in the very area where all of the Semitic or Canaanite peoples are at their strongest. And although technically it's an Egyptian dynasty, from the names of the different kings, it's clear that most of them were Canaanite. And so this was a Canaanite dynasty. And so they were almost preparing the grounds for the incoming Hyksos warlords that would come into the country and become the kings. Now, those Hyksos kings, once they enter the country, form their own dynasty, which is the 15th dynasty. Okay. Now, This is all very complicated, but please try and go with me on it.
Yeah, I am.
There is another dynasty that rises around this time, the 16th, which I'm going to be honest, is so confusing that I've not even dealt with it in the book, because some people suggest it was Egyptian, some people suggest it was Hyksos. I mean, they just don't really know. But what comes out the 13th dynasty is the 17th dynasty. Now, that seems to simply be an extension of the 13th dynasty. You've got more kings there that have names dedicated, so that honor Sobek, and it is the kings from that dynasty that begin to rise up against the Hyksos, ending with two brothers by the name of Kamos and Ahmose, who Kamos is the last king of the 17th dynasty, and Ahmose becomes the first king of the 18th dynasty. And they completely rout the Hyksos. They get rid of them. They send them packing back to where they came from, which was probably northern Palestine, Syria area.
So they basically did what the brother did by letting them all in. They did eventually, over a period of a few years, they did manage to take over, and that's what happened with the 14th.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah. In other words, it was a process that probably began during the time of Sobek Nofru's father, Amenemhet III. In fact, there are certain statues that show her father in a style of dress. I mean, the statue iconography that very much matches that of the later Hyksos. Now you say, well, why is that? Well, he was clearly trying to appeal to the maximum audience. So not just the native Egyptians, but also the incoming Canaanite people. So he would show himself dressed in the same style as the Canaanite peoples. He was obviously trying to keep everybody happy. They were opening the borders. They were saying, look, come to Egypt. There's plenty on offer here, plenty of jobs to, all round. And that was great. But unfortunately, it seemed like her brother took it too far, was being influenced by people that were probably taking the country in the wrong direction. And this is when certain factions, as I said, probably connected with the cult of Sobek, came to Sobek Nofru and said, look, you got to do something about this. Otherwise, Egypt is going to fall. What's interesting is that one particular Egyptologist tackles this business And he says, I wonder whether they were having premonitions about the coming turmoil that would occur, with the Second Intermediate Period, with this terrible Dark Age. Premonitions, that's the actual word that's used.
That's amazing.
Now, I mean, whether they mean psychic dreams or just intuition or gut feeling, I don't know, but I'm certain that's what was going on. They knew that unless they did something, Egypt would fall forever.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure it would have.
Oh, it would have done. There's no question. Without her, if her brother had been left in charge of the country, everything would have just fallen apart.
I understand now where you say that without her, we wouldn't be living the way we are now. It would have changed.
Yeah. And I mean, all right, we don't know. I mean, obviously, but let's say without Egyptian history or the second half of it, from the New Kingdom onwards, if that hadn't have existed, where would the world be now? I mean, maybe a better place, maybe a worse place. We don't know, but it would certainly be different. And if you think that the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 changed our perspective of ancient Egypt, we had Art Deco, architecture changed, art changed, styles, jewelry changed, everything changed in the world. And that was simply through the discovery of one single tomb. So, that shows you just how much impact Egypt has had on our modern world. So how much has it had, let's say, on the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Coptic Christians? I mean, what would have happened? Maybe all of this would have been a completely different world in which we live. So
did she have any children, or because you said that you didn't know whether those two younger ones were hers or the brothers?
Well, the two younger, the two, I think they probably were brothers, and they became the first two kings of the 13th dynasty. Both of them had Amenemhet as part of their name, and that clearly shows that they're an extension of the dynasty that had just gone. Now, it has been suggested by Kim Reichhold, who's a major Egyptologist that's looked a lot at this period, that they were the sons of Amenemhet IV, in other words, Sobekneferu's brother.
Right.
And that, clearly they rose to become the first two kings. Now, but then you say to yourself, well, okay, let's assume that that's right for the moment. Why is it that they would have followed a woman who may well have killed their father? And the only answer to that is that, that either she somehow convinced them that this was the right thing to do, or she had a more personal connection with them. And that has suggested to some people that they could have been her own children.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But if they were her own children, who was the father? And the chances are that they would have been those of Amenemhet IV, her brother, because I think that all the indications are that at the beginning of his reign they were very, very close. Apparently. I think that they may well have been, very close.
A little too close.
Yeah.
Wow, that must have made family gatherings very interesting. Holy.
Well, quite. But I mean, remember, it's all official. It's like, I mean, they were clearly quite close as brother and sister, and then they start to rule together. And as I said, it's not clear whether this was official or unofficial. But I'm pretty certain that if she had not ruled alongside her brother, there's no way that she would have been called upon to take over the country. And also, what about these two young children? Surely they should have taken precedence over anybody else.
Absolutely. Mind you,
and it's not simply a case that she was a regent. Sorry, that she essentially was acting on their behalf, until they came of age. This doesn't seem to be the case. She was fully fledged Pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt.
I wonder if somebody struck a deal with her.
Well, they did. That's exactly what I think happened.
But they did strike the deal.
Yeah, definitely.
So Who of this? There's two younger ones. They carried on. You said that they carried on to reign. Did they have kids? Did that go down, or did that?
Probably. I mean, the problem with the 13th dynasty is that it's so vague as far as our knowledge of that dynasty is concerned, that all we have really is names that are recorded by the Chronicles of the Kings. In the Chronicles of the Kings, Manetho most obviously, but also their names crop up, in discoveries on archaeological digs. But the context is often difficult to interpret, and we just don't know enough. This is definitely the beginning of this dark age. Now, some people suggest that the second intermediate period didn't begin until after this particular dynasty, but I can't see that. And I mean, so I have classed it all beginning with the end of her reign, with her death. So we don't know enough, is the honest answer, to know, who their sons were and who their sons, whatever. And also, it's quite clear that a lot of these 13th dynasty rulers were probably just princes rising up, and were ruling for very short periods of time. I mean, probably just months, some of them.
Yeah. I wonder where they all are. I mean, obviously they found
some. Well, again, I mean, burials are being found here and there. I mean, one of the Sobek Hotep kings was discovered recently, I think down in Abydos, if I remember, in the southern part of the country. But at first they thought that it was Sobek Hotep I, which would have been the one directly after Sobek Nofru, but it's now thought that he was the fourth of them, the fourth in line. So, so that doesn't really help us to understand the transition from the 12th to the 13th dynasty. So, yeah, and I mean, the other problem, of course, is that once the Hyksos came into the country, they trashed the place. They trashed, Memphis, the capital, Itawi, I can't remember it's the exact name, but that's on the banks of the Nile at the same latitude as the Fayum. The Fayum itself, they almost certainly trashed that. The palaces, the temples, which is why the kings of the 13th dynasty had to move right to the south of the country and rule from Thebes down there. And Thebes is the seat of the god Amun, right. Hence their names, Amun Emet or whatever. Yeah. So they were safe down there. And it seems as if the 14th dynasty and the 13th dynasty, although they may have warred and battled each other for a bit, it seems as if they eventually reached an agreement for trading, probably for religious purposes and whatever, to allow each other to exist. But it was quite clear that the Egyptian dynasty was like a puppet dynasty. It was, it was considered too weak to do anything, really. So exactly. It was almost just there in name,
Yeah. Are there any monuments around the world for her? Anything left over?
Well, in Egypt, almost everything is associated with the Fayum region to do with her. There's a few blocks and lintels from other sites just outside of the Fayum, which I talk about, and there is one statue of her that was found in what is today Israel. Now it's only the feet, but it's got very clear inscriptions in her name, and that begs the question of what the hell it was doing there. Egyptologists have said, oh well, maybe when the Hyksos were departing Egypt, they took a whole load of stuff with them and deposited it, in their own homeland of Canaan. It just doesn't seem right to me. I think that there's good evidence to suggest that before she rose to power, either during the reign of her father or perhaps during the early years of her brother's reign, she acted as an envoy into Canaan, and that in other words, she would meet these vassal kings, these rulers of these city states, and maybe present them with a statue, because in theory Egypt was in control of them. So this was a cursory visit to say, right, everything going okay, trading all okay still with the country, and just remember who's in charge, and that's what those sort of visits would have been. And I think that she could have been involved in that. And the reason I say that is that various other statues have been found of officials in Canaan, as far north as the Lebanon, and what we know about the people whose names are connected with them is that they all had links with Canaan. In other words, they were, they were like envoys for Egypt going into Canaan. As I said, for various reasons, mostly for trade, really. But as I said, there was a lot of Canaanite and Semitic speaking people coming into Egypt from the time of Sobek-Nofru's father, and arguably even before that. And that they were doing essential jobs. I mean, in the Fayum, for instance, it seemed as if they were involved with a massive engineering project to recut a canal from the Nile all the way through to the Fayum Lake. And the reason why this was important is so that when the Nile floods came down off the mountains each year from Ethiopia, the waters wouldn't completely flood everywhere, basically. So the canal was recut so that the waters would be much lower, because if you had too high a flood, it would completely drown the lands and they would not recover sufficiently enough to do the planting the following spring. Whereas if it was just right, obviously the rich nutrients that would be brought down with the Nile floods, with the so-called inundation, would be enough to enrich the soil to allow the growth of the seeds and the grains, whatever it is, to rise up the following year. And what's very interesting is that during various of the years of her father, the floods were clearly far too high, because in southern Egypt, on the border with Sudan, or what was obviously Nubia in the past, there are various marks on the rock about what height the floods were reaching. And it's quite clear that during a certain stage, during her father's reign, they were going far too high. This would have been really bad for Egypt. And this coincides with engineering projects which we know took place during the reign of her father. They may have even been started earlier than that, but certainly they took place during her father's reign. But what's so interesting is that Herodotus, in his histories written about 450 BC, he alludes to these engineering projects under the Greek name of Amenemhet IV, which is Maurice, basically. But what's so interesting is that Arab accounts of these same engineering projects talk about the person in control of them as being Joseph, he of the technicolored coat story from the book of Genesis. Now, what do we know about him? Well, according to the biblical account, he's the son of Jacob. His brothers don't like him. They beat him up, leave him for dead, take his coat, and eventually he's sold as a slave into Egypt. He is in the household of a guy, I can't remember, Potiphar, and he does a good job, but according to the story, the wife of Potiphar comes onto him and he rejects her. So she claims, essentially that, he tried to make advances to her, and he gets thrown into prison, and he's there for a while, but he becomes renowned for interpreting dreams. So Pharaoh gets to hear about this. So he sends for Joseph, tells Joseph about this story about, I'm having these weird dreams about 7 fat cows and 7 thin cows. What's all that about then? And Joseph says, no problem. You've got 7 years to stock up, with grain in your grain stores, because you're then going to have 7 years of famine. And you need to be prepared for this so you can feed the whole country and anybody else that comes to you at this time. So this is exactly what happens. And eventually Joseph becomes, I can't remember the exact term it says in the Bible, but basically the number one person in the country other than the Pharaoh. And that can only be vizier. That's the role of the number two in Egypt. He's called the vizier. And I mean, my colleague, David Rowe, has done a lot about this. He's talked about, that this is clearly a reference to all the activities that were going on during the reign of Amenemhet III. He even finds a tomb in the Nile Delta, a place called Tel El Darba, where there's a statue that's found. It's very clearly in the Semitic Canaanite style. It's a big statue. He says that's of Joseph. I mean, what he writes is great, and I do quote him in the book. And he basically says that Joseph was a real person, and that he was in Egypt during the time of Sobeknofru's father, during the time of her brother, and during the time of Sobeknofru herself, and may even have been there when the first two kings of the 13th dynasty took over. So that's interesting, because this tells us there's a possibility that Joseph may have met Sobeknofru.
It sounds very right.
We have to imagine what might have gone down in that conversation. And the interesting thing about that point is that Potiphar would seem to have been a high priest of Heliopolis, the very priesthood that are associated with the Canaanites during this period. By the way, Heliopolis is referred to in the Bible as On, just the letters O-N, basically.
Really?
And so, in other words, Joseph is clearly working under the auspice of the temple of Heliopolis, the temple of Ra. And I mean, I haven't put this in the book, but various people have suggested that there is a relationship between the god Ra, the sun god, and Yahweh, essentially the god of the Israelites. But I didn't really go into that in the book. But so that's interesting. So if he was vizier and certainly representing the temple of Heliopolis, then the temple of Heliopolis would almost certainly be the ones that were opposing her, because they didn't like all these changes that she was making. She was changing everything back to the way it had been.
Right.
They didn't like that at all.
Well,
and I think that it was them who came for her. But in the book, I sort of imagine this meeting between Joseph and Sobeknofru, where he's basically saying to her, look, I understand your position, but you realize that, what you've done is going to end up in your death if you do not change things back to the way that they were. And, this may well have been the final conversation that they had. Yeah, I imagine that, that this was how it went down. I mean, whether it did or not, we don't know. But
I'm pretty sure they would have done that at that time.
But, because he was unquestionably aligned to the Temple of Heliopolis, and they were the ones that were coming for her. And I think that at the end of her reign, she really knew that her time was up. I mean, that they were coming for her literally, and that the options were let them take you, let them put you to death, let them parade you around the streets, make you look very weak. And this, of course, is exactly why Cleopatra committed suicide. She didn't want to be dragged off to Rome and paraded around the streets, before being publicly executed, probably. So I think that was exactly the same with Sobeknofru, that she decided that the best thing was she'd done a job, and for the sake of, cosmic truth, justice, order in the country, she'd done what she needed to do. Now she needed to get out. But then the question becomes, what happened to her at the point of death? Did she receive the same type of mortuary rituals that would be given to the other kings? And remember, these have to be done, at a set time, over a period of 90 odd days. Then you'd be moved from one temple to the next, from the valley temple, the valley temple to the mortuary temple, and finally into the tomb or the pyramid. And all this had to be done at the right time. Otherwise, your soul was not going to enter the afterlife in the correct way.
Right.
Well, I would say that a lot of corners were cut in her burial. And I think there is a good chance that she didn't even make it into a pyramid. I think that she was secretly buried in probably an existing tomb that was probably cut for another court official or something that was requisited for her. And I think it's somewhere in the northern Fayum area. That would be my guess.
It's going to be fascinating to see that unfold. I wonder if she's anywhere near Saqqara.
What's that?
I wonder if she's anywhere near Saqqara.
Well, I mean, obviously others have speculated. By the way, this is the first book on her. I mean, clearly she receives, a few pages in any book on, the history of the kings of Egypt, but they don't say much about her really. Ultimately,
clearly she's a fascinating figure. I mean,
look, I've written a whole book about her, and I mean, I haven't messed about. I mean, this is a thick old book. I mean, this is nearly 120,000 words. I mean, and with thousands of references, thousands of well, seems like thousands anyway, of bibliography entries. I've pieced the story together, and I'm meticulous in this way to try and get every single fact and juggle them around until I've got answers. And that's what I've done in this book, and so I think I've got every piece of evidence, but it's always the way. The book comes out, the first thing that happens is either you find an error in the book. That's almost the first thing that you ever do when you open a book. I think, oh God, you've read a book about 100 times, and then the first thing you do, you open it, oh my God, look, there's an error. It almost happens with every book that you ever do. But luckily, generally, they're only typos or whatever. But what's happened with this book is that somebody sent me a video of somebody inside the temple of Medinet Mahdi, which, by the way, we're going as part of our Egyptian tour in November. By the way, we're going to all these sites, and we're going in search of Sobek-Nofru in November. If you want to come with us, all the details are on andrewcollins.com. Doing it with Hugh Newman and JJ Ainsworth of Megalithomania. So, check out all of that. So everything's on andrewcollins.com if you want to have
afterwards. I'll get
we'll talk about all that afterwards. But anyway, I'm sorry, I've lost my thread going on to the commercial side of it.
Going in November.
So obviously other people have speculated on where she is, and there are a few minor pyramids in Saqqara and in Dashur that have not been claimed. I mean, they don't know, who was put inside them. There's no obvious inscriptions, and it has been suggested that maybe one of these was hers, but it's pure speculation. I mean, nobody ultimately knows. What we do know is that there is a reference to, as I said, this cult in her name that's from the second intermediate period, and it actually refers to what appears to be her place of burial, and it's called Sekhem Sobek-Nofru, something or other, which, I mean, the word Sekhem is a word that basically means power, really, but it can also mean mighty, and it's the word Sekhem. It's a magical force as well, not just a physical force, but the most obvious name that comes out of it is Sekhmet, which is the lion-headed goddess, and one of the royal names of Sobek-Nofru includes the word Sekhem, and it's clear that she put this word out as very important to her. In other words, I am mighty, I am powerful, I have a magical force behind me, that is, essentially the force of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess. So we know the name of her burial place. Right. But the problem is, we don't know whether this was the place that was going to be for her, and she never reached. In other words, Mazguna, North Pyramid, or whether it's a secret. place of burial. It's completely unclear. And as I said, even by the time of the 18th dynasty, her place of burial was lost, because otherwise people wouldn't be wandering all over the place looking for it and going into random 12th dynasty tombs thinking it might be hers. Yeah. But the other important thing is that, as I said, a cult in her name continues on. She would seem to have been revered almost as some kind of goddess from that point onwards. I mean, the book cover talks about the goddess of the 7 stars. This is really a term that shouldn't really be applied to her. Avatar of the 7 stars may be a better term. Not so much goddess. She's not a goddess in that way, but she was certainly revered as a living deity. In other words, somebody who continued to not just continue to exist after, in other words, she'd gone to the afterlife, but that she was still around, that you could still contact her. And I find that very, very interesting. Yeah. Particularly in this way of her resurrection. I think we should talk about this, because come the 19th century, almost nothing was known about her. In fact, nothing was known about her. The only thing that you had was this mention in Manetho of this female ruler called Skemiothris. Okay. And she quite clearly was seen as a monarch of the 12th dynasty. She was the sister of the previous king, Amenemhet IV. They'd worked that one out, but that was it. So I knew nothing else about her whatsoever. Then what starts happening is that you start finding king lists at places like Thebes, in Saqqara, another one at Abydos, which we'll talk about. And you find mention of her proper name. Then, of course, Karl Lepsius, the German archaeologist, starts finding loads of stuff to do with her at the site of the labyrinth, the Egyptian labyrinth in the Pharaoh. And a lot of questions start being asked about, well, who is this woman? I mean, she's obviously a lot more important than simply a queen. She's a proper ruler. She rules the country. She was clearly crowned. Yeah. She wasn't somebody who, let's say, was ruling because the next king was so young they couldn't do anything about it. So it was a regent. And also, she's not ruling simply because her husband is off at war somewhere in the next country. She is clearly a monarch in her own right, the first female pharaoh of Egypt. Right. So people started asking questions, and one of the people that asked questions was an Egyptologist, European Egyptologist by the name of Heinrich Brugsch, or Brugsch Bey, as he's affectionately known in books. And he talks about her quite extensively in his books, and basically says that the 13th dynasty was clearly in honor of her because of all the different kings called Sobek Hotep, essentially the servant of Sobek. And so he starts really bigging her up. And one of the people that picked up on this was a more speculative writer of Egyptology by the name of Gerald Massey. And he writes a series of books on Egyptian religion and how it relates to other religions, everything from African religions to Near Eastern religions and even European religions. And he talks a lot about Sobek-Nofru, basically suggesting that she is reviving a very ancient cult to do with Sobek as the crocodile, which is also a symbol of the god Set, who is like the trickster or god of chaos, but also the mother of Sobek and Set in some cases, who is this hippopotamus goddess who Massey refers to as the great mother of time. Okay. And he goes on and on and on about her. He says she's a form of Hathor, the 7 forms of Hathor and the rest of it. And so he basically says that Sobek-Nofru reignited this whole cult. And he calls it quite literally a star cult, a cult of the stars. Wow. Yeah, again, this is where this goddess of the stars. In fact, he refers to this great mother of time, who we know under the name now as Neith, the hippopotamus goddess. He refers to her as the goddess of the 7 stars. That's the term that he uses for her on many occasions in his books. I mean, like Egypt, Light of the World, Natural Genesis, third one, which I can't remember. And so he talks about this. Well, he's writing this, and it would seem as if somebody is reading this book, and that somebody is Bram Stoker, the writer of Dracula. And he's reading what all of this stuff about Sobek Nofra and thinking she'd be a great character in one of my books. And this is exactly what happens. But it isn't as easy as that, because firstly, in his book, The Jewel of 7 Stars, which is published in 1903 for the first time, the story is that there's this the Egyptologist, British Egyptologist, goes to Egypt, finds this tomb of this female pharaoh, brings it back to the UK, starts being plagued by all sorts of weird stuff, and feels that they've got to do this ritual to resurrect her. They've got her remains, they've got all that they need. They got this jewel, the Jewel of 7 Stars, which is like this red, ruby beetle with the 7 stars of Ursa Major on it. So they do this ritual. It takes place in this place in Land's End, or near Land's End in England. It's actually on the Lizard, by the way. I mean, I actually had a chapter all about this, which I was going to put in the book. Eventually dropped it out because it just was so away from the main theme of the book. But anyway, so they do this ritual, and essentially what happens is that the daughter, the 18-year-old daughter of the Egyptologist, gradually gets taken over by this female pharaoh, who in the book is called Terra, T-E-R-A, Queen Terra. And it's clear that she's taken her over. And by the end of the book, there's a whole lot of weird supernatural stuff happens, and eventually Terra is gone, and so is the daughter, right? And it's clear that Terra's taken over the literally the body of the daughter and gone, basically. And the way that the ending of the book was done was so shocking to the post-Victorian audience that read Bram Stoker's book, which was just a few years after Dracula, let's point this out, came out, that the publishers called in Bram Stoker and said, look, you've got to find a different ending for any subsequent editions. This is too shocking for our audiences. They're all complaining and they're all swooning and dropping over, no, I made that bit out. But, I mean, clearly they weren't happy with it. So he did change it, where everything, at the end of it, everybody lives happily ever after, sort of thing. But the significance here is that Stoker says that this female ruler, her particular reign was completely expunged from Egyptian history. Now, this is partially correct. Sobek Nofru's name definitely is avoided in some of the king lists. And the most obvious one is at Abydos in the southern part of the country. Because if you go in there, I mean, some of your viewers will have been to Abydos, they'll know where I'm talking about. If you pass through the huge temple of Seti and you go through this corridor out towards this monument called the Osirium at the back, and it's this deep, sunken, weird megalithic temple. On the wall is an image of Seti I with his young son, Ramesses, who's going to the future, Ramesses II. And he's showing him all the cartouches of all of the kings who have ruled before him, up to and including that time. So, if you read them, you have Amenemhet III, Amenemhet IV, that's Akhenaten's, Sobek Nofru's brother, and then none until the beginning of the 18th dynasty. First king there is Ahmose. They're all gone. So that's the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, the 16th, the 17th dynasties, not there. Now, all right, if they saw this as such a dark period of Egypt, I can understand why they might want to just forget it. Okay, but why blame her? Why is her name not there? And the answer has to be that they saw her as somehow responsible for what happened. I mean, clearly wrongly, and because they just didn't have enough information. So she was blanked from the king list. I mean, she's there in others. She's there in one from Saqqara. She's there at one at Thebes. So she wasn't completely blanked. But it's obvious that one of the reasons why we have so little statuary and architecture relating to her is that her name was a sponge from history after her reign. Excuse me.
That is disgusting. This sodding thing is going to be mad. Sorry. The name of the book is Goddess of the Seven Stars?
No. it's the first female pharaoh.
No, not your book.
Oh, sorry, that book. No, that book is called The Jewel of Seven Stars.
Jewel of the Seven Stars.
It's a brilliant book, by the way. I mean, I would recommend it to anybody to read. It is, and the other interesting thing about it is, if you're interested in things like the occult, Victoriana, is that Bram Stoker hung around all the occultists of the age. He worked at the time at the Lyceum Theatre. He was a manager there, and lots of people in the occult world doubled up as actresses, painters of scenes and things like this, and they all passed through the Lyceum. And amongst the people that was working at the Lyceum at the same time as him was a lady by the name of Florence Farr. Now, she's a well-known occultist. She got into Eastern mysticism or whatever eventually. She was also an actress, a playwright, a musician, and she was channeling at this time an Egyptian woman who she referred to as the Egyptian contact. And this was giving instructions on how to create this new magical order, which she set up inside an existing order known as the Golden Dawn. And the group that she set up was known as the Sphere. And it only supposedly was meant to have something like 12 people at any one time. And they visualized this three-dimensional tree of life, this Kabbalistic form, in the middle of which was this Egyptian figure. And they would communicate with it, and they'd have visions and, instructions on what to do. Now, the people in the Golden Dawn who weren't a part of this group really started getting worried about this, because they felt that this was evil, quite literally, and that was, wrong, and she shouldn't be doing. Florence Farr shouldn't be doing this. She was obviously being taken over by this Egyptian spirit. And this is exactly the story, of course, in Bram Stoker's The Jewel of Seven Stars, about this, this young woman that's gradually being taken over by this Egyptian royal female. And I'm certain this is the other half of Bram Stoker's book. And there are indirect links between Florence Farr and the revival of Sobek-Nofru in the 20th century, through the writings of this occult writer named Kenneth Grant, a very clever, extraordinary writer, and incredibly knowledgeable of ancient religions. And he wrote a series of 3 trilogies, so 9 books in total, which are known as the Typhonian trilogies today. And in these, he seriously bigs up Sobek-Nofru as the founder and the revival of this, what he refers to as the Typhonian or Draconian current, basically this like magical current that begins in ancient Egypt, is revived by Sobek-Nofru, and then permeates through magical religious orders right the way through to the present day, very much like lineages in Tibet, for instance, with from different deities or groups, different orders of monks or whatever. And Kenneth Grant talks a lot about her, and he in his final book does make the link between her and Queen Tira in The Jewel of Seven Stars. Having said that, I'd already written about this in my own book, The Seventh Sword, which came out in 1991, where I talk about her. So, that was the first book that makes the link between Queen Tira of The Jewel of Seven Stars and Sobek-Nofru. So, yeah, I mean, that sort of brings it virtually up to date. And then you have to say to yourself, well, what is all this about, people seeing her in dreams and visions, Sobek-Nofru. And this is a really interesting thing. I mean, this is more than simply random. I mean, there are various Egyptian female rulers. You've got Hatshepsut, you've got Nefertiti, you've got Cleopatra, various other, incredible women that ruled in between times. I mean, they're not that many, to be honest. There's probably a couple of dozen at the most, but most of those, as I said, they all came up after the time of Sobek-Nofru. But it's Sobek-Nofru that keeps appearing to people in dreams. Why is that? And, one can only but speculate. And is it, the way I sense it, it's almost like her story has to be told. And if she's being a sponge from history in a way that's not like some of her contemporaries, like Hatshepsut or whatever, it's almost like she's trying to come in through the back door. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Her story has to be told. And in a way, this is exactly what Bram Stoker was trying to suggest in The Jewel of Seven Stars. And it's the same in various of these horror films that have been written with the same character in. The latest of which was The Mummy from 2017 that starred Tom Cruise, right. Which had a few nods actually to the period of Sobek-Nofru. It doesn't talk about her specifically. But I think that the best film, if people, want to watch one that's the closest to really getting to grips with Sobek-Nofru, it's The Awakening from 1980. You can watch it for free on YouTube if you want, or obviously a better quality version on Prime or whatever. That's brilliant because most of it is actually set in Egypt. Most of the other adaptations of Bram Stoker's book are not set in Egypt. And I think it's brilliant the way that it's portrayed in there. And it's, and when finally, the Queen Tira, although she's called Kara in that film, which is very interesting because Sobek-Nofru's throne name is Sobek-Kara. So Kara is merely a shortening of her name, and it's clear that the scriptwriters of The Awakening were very much aware that Bram Stoker's book was based on Sobek-Nofru and have given various nods to that, including the fact that the Egyptian Pharaoh comes back from the dead in that film is said to have lived in 1800 BC. Well, that can only be her. There cannot be anybody else.
So just to quickly go back to the thing that you said about the lizard in Cornwall.
Yeah. And
you said that you didn't think it had anything to do with it?
Well, no, it has a lot to do with it, but not to do with my book. I mean, as I said, I wrote a whole chapter because I actually went down to the lizard to try and find the house that Bram Stoker based his story on. And I found it. It's on the southwestern part of the lizard. Bram Stoker gives enough details of where it is. And it's now a hotel. Can't remember exactly which hotel it is, but it's on the lizard, and there are caves beneath it, which is exactly as he described, which were used for piracy. He says that the cave had green rock in it. It has green rock. I mean, there is just too much for this not to be the right place, basically.
Well, and to me, that whole thing about the lizard.
Yeah.
If a crocodile isn't a gigantic lizard, I don't know what is.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
It's kind of
yeah.
Thing,
I mean, I'm sure the etymologists would probably say that the name of the lizard in Cornwall probably doesn't come from a big reptile thing, but but yeah, I see where you're going with that. Yeah, I mean, Bram Stoker would appear to have been in that region. I mean, a lot of artists, a lot of writers, all would go to the Lizard. This you'll find in various historical books, basically.
It's kind of fantastic.
So
that is kind of fantastic, though, isn't it? I'm trying to find, somebody asked. There was a couple of questions. Leo, have you got some questions ready? I know he can hear me. And one of our people, this is probably totally off topic, so we might as well leave it to the end. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
No, there it is. At the end, I'd love to know his thoughts on the mud flood, Tartaria, conspiracy, and plasma melting old civilizations into stone.
Yeah.
Today, but
okay. Right. Mud flood Tartaria. Don't know anything about it at all. Plasma melting old civilizations into stone. This is something that's come off the edge of the whole plasma universe idea. And it's something that my colleague Robert Schoch talks a lot about in his lectures and books, that that there was some kind of cataclysm. I think the date he gives is 9600 BC, where there was some kind of almost like a coronal mass ejection that quite literally covered the earth in lightning for a period of time and melted a lot of rock and quite clearly destroyed civilizations. I personally haven't found any real evidence that occurred. I mean, it could have done. We certainly know that there was a comet impact in 10,800 BC, and it caused a series of further cataclysms in the 100 years, well, certainly 300 years after that time. But by that time also there was a mini ice age that lasts all the way down to 9600 BC, which is the time that Göbekli Tepe is constructed. And something happened in 9600 BC. There's was it the meltwater pulse B event, a real sudden rise in water at that time, which was seen to have been caused very suddenly by a event occurring. This might have been associated with the plasma events that he's talking about. It's possible, but that's just a thought at this time.
Interesting. And if he's been called back to work, he'll have to pay this back and listen to your answer later on. Well, I think it's unless anybody else has got any more questions, I think we've done well. I'm not going to knacker you.
Well, you can knacker me, but I mean, all right. Let's just say a few things then. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to come with us to Egypt in November, we're doing the whole length of the Nile, part of it as a cruise. This will involve, private visits to the Great Pyramid, the Assyrian, and obviously we'll be going in 4x4 vehicles out into the Fayum to the Khazriel Saga Temple, which is just one of the most enigmatic monuments in the whole of Egypt. And I spend a whole chapter trying to deal with that in the book and pulling together every piece of evidence. We're also going to Turkey in May next month for a couple of weeks, going to all the obvious places there, Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and everywhere in between from there to Istanbul. I'm going back there in evil. Sorry, I can see the word evil there. That's affecting my head. Back there in September for a couple of weeks for another tour, mostly in the eastern part of the country. So let's read what it says here. Could you please explain why the crocodile representation of her is not evil, or am I wrong? It really was.
I think she missed the beginning where you explained why the crocodile.
Right. Okay. Well, look. I mean, the crocodile's not evil at all. I mean, the only way that it became evil in Egypt is because of its association not with the god Sobek, but with the god Set. Now, Set was the brother of Osiris, and according to the legend, Set tricked his brother into this coffin, locked it up, threw it in the Nile, and killed him. He was resurrected by his sister Isis, but then in a further account, his body is split into 14 different pieces and spread out across the whole of Egypt, and they find every part of him other than his phallus, apparently, and Isis puts the whole lot back together again, and somehow she's able to, mate with him and create the son, who is Horus. I mean, so in other words, Set becomes the evil god in Egypt, and he, in some of the traditions, is the offspring of Neith, and he's also associated. No, sorry, hold on. Let me get this right. Yes, Sobek is the son of Set in some of the traditions. So there's a definite link between those two. And I try and cover this in the book towards the end when I deal with all the astronomy associated with it. So the reason why the crocodile becomes evil is because of its connection with Set. And then what happens is that in early Christian times, in Coptic Christian tradition, Satan was shown as Set or as a crocodile, and Horus, with his hawk head, is shown spearing the crocodile as Set or as Satan. In other words, the familiar image that we have from Christianity of St. Michael or St. George spearing the dragon, the Egyptian form of that is Horus on the horse spearing the crocodile. So that's the reason why the crocodile was seen as evil.
Crazy stuff. Waiting to see if I'm going to be able to talk about.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Yep.
And so let us draw into an end before I die of needing coffee.
Yeah, everybody's saying thank you. I can't put them all up, but if I do it on behalf of the people throughout the whole show saying thank you and hi and all those, I didn't want to throw those up during the show, but I thought about doing that. But there was a lot of that going on. So
there's a quick question from Nikki. Is Egyptian history considered mythology, allegory, or is it at this point in our understanding as history?
Probably a bit of all of that, really. I would have thought. Yeah. I mean, allegory is mythology, or certainly can be, and I mean, it's certainly not to be taken as factual history, I don't think. But when you talk about the age of the gods, when you look at things like the foundation texts or building texts at places like Edfu in southern Egypt, they clearly talk about a previous age where there was a cataclysm, a time of darkness, an object appearing in the sky, which is described as the enemy snake, which I think is a comet, a period of destruction, a flood that completely destroys a primeval island, the temple structure. All of this, I think, does refer to a very real event in human history, which we know today as the Younger Dryas impact event of 10,800 BC. And that's recorded on temple walls. I mean, probably in the past, it would have been on every Egyptian wall, because every temple was supposed to have its foundation texts, how it came into existence, right from the beginning, from creation to this day, so to speak. The best preserved of those foundation texts or building texts is on the temple of Edfu in southern Egypt.
Excellent. Thank you. And
my pleasure.
And again.
Right. Okay. Well, look, as I said, if anybody's interested in getting this book, it's called The First Female Pharaoh, Sobek Nofru, Goddess of the Seven Stars. And available now from Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And I think you'll enjoy it. I mean, it's a sensible book. It's not difficult to read, but it's a sensible book.
No,
I've done it as if I was a Egyptologist. And I'd like to think that it's well received by Egyptological students and by everybody else, of course.
You know what they're like. But I think we need to touch base again and see how it goes. There's been several people have already ordered it.
Well, I thank you all. Thank you, Denise. I see she had ordered it, and I'm sure many of your other viewers have already done so.
And we're going to have a couple to be able to give away, thanks to your kindly Inner Traditions people who are fabulous. So we're going to have to come up with an idea on how we're going to do that. And so when we finished being live, you and I will have a quick chat and find out how we're going to do it. And then Caleb, he's one of our boys.
Well, I mean, I would ask the question of where the hell is she buried, but I think that is not going to create a consensus answer.
But it might be interesting,
right?
Yeah, I don't think you haven't got enough prizes for that. I don't think, but
that's true. That's true.
She'll turn up one day. They'll find her eventually.
Hopefully, we're still on the planet when that happens.
Right?
All of them. So thanks, Andrew. It's been fantastic.
That's my pleasure.
And I look forward
as always. Thank you both.
What's in the pipeline?
Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching.
Absolutely. Have you got anything else in the pipeline, writing-wise, or is it?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, in between all of this, I'm just finishing a brand new book on Göbekli Tepe, which is the greatest archaeological discovery of the 21st century. I finished all the writing of that. I'm doing all the illustrations at the moment. I've got about 50 illustrations to do, about 47 colour plates to find. So that in between. Oh, that's right. Next week, I'm at Megalithomania in Glastonbury, 6th or 7th of May, talking about Sobek Nofri for the first time ever. I mean, publicly. Awesome. So I've got to do my lecture for that in the week. So, if you've got nothing better to do with your time, I'll see you in Glastonbury next Sunday.
Will you link me after we've sort of finished?
I was just going to say that. Thank you.
We can shove
get
it
a link so we can get it to people.
And we can put it out wherever else we are.
Okay.
Link me with all that stuff.
I think you can still get tickets for it if you're up for it. I mean, it's organised obviously by Megalithomania, and that's Hugh Newman. Their website is megalithomania.co.uk. Clearly, I've got links to it on my website, which is andrewcollins.com. And if you so wish to contact me about anything that I've said tonight, please do so. There's an email address on there, on my website, on the opening page of my website.
Be prepared.
Well, I mean, I'm intrigued. I mean, I'm happy to receive correspondence from people. It's weird. A lot of people think that they shouldn't write to you. It's like, A, that you'll never respond, or B, that, you never even see your emails because you've got so many people working for you. I've got nobody working for me. It's just me. So I see everything.
That's awesome, though, isn't it?
Well, yeah, although I could do with 4 pairs of hands and an extra 24 hours in a day.
Well, yeah, that we could all do that, though, couldn't we?
Indeed.
So, again, thank you so much from the hearts of our bottoms. And
it's my pleasure. It's always a pleasure being on here.
Excellent. Thank you. And we look forward to the next one.
Thank you. Absolutely. I'll see you this time next year then.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye, everybody.
There, everybody. Have a good evening, day, whatever it is, in your part of the world.
Yeah, wherever it is, whatever time it is around the world where you're tuning into the show, right?